Caught my business partner practicing his speech in the parking lot, not rehearsing a presentation, not running through talking points before a client call. I mean, he was standing next to his car at 7 in the morning, whispering to himself, pacing in small circles, stopping to wipe his eyes with the back of his hand like he was crying. Then he'd straighten up, roll his shoulders back, and do it again. I watched him for about 45 seconds from the second-floor window of our shop. Then I went back to my office and sat down at my desk and didn't say anything to anybody. That was a Tuesday in March. By the following Thursday, I was sitting across from a lawyer I'd never met, being told that I had defrauded my own company. Let me back up. My name is not important. What's important is that I spent 11 years building a custom cabinet and millwork shop in Central Ohio. Started with a used table saw, a cargo van with a cracked windshield, and a contract to do the built-ins for a new dental office in Westerville. I slept on my brother-in-law's couch for 4 months because I couldn't afford my apartment and the equipment lease at the same time. I drove 40 minutes each way to a storage unit every morning because that's where I kept my tools. I ate gas station sandwiches for lunch 6 days a week. By the time any of this story matters, we had 18 employees, a 12,000 square foot shop, 3 delivery trucks, and a client list that included 2 commercial developers, a high-end residential contractor, and a regional hotel chain that ordered custom furniture for every new property they opened. We were clearing about $2.4 million a year in revenue. Not tech money, not life-changing money, but real money. Built with my hands and my credit score and a lot of years I'm never getting back. My business partner, I'll call him my partner because that's what the paperwork said, came in 5 years ago. His name is Seth. We'd known each other since our early 30s through a woodworking club, of all things. He had a background in sales and operations, and I was drowning in the business side of things. I was good at building. I was not good at invoicing, vendor negotiation, or keeping track of what jobs were profitable and which ones I was basically doing for free. Seth came in with a 20% equity stake in exchange for handling operations. It made sense at the time. For the first 2 years, it was fine. Better than fine. He cleaned up the back office mess I'd made, got us on actual project management software, landed a couple of contracts I never would have found on my own. I gave him a lot of credit for that period of growth, and I told him so. I thought we had a good thing. What I didn't see, or maybe what I didn't want to see, was the slow shift that started happening around year 3. Small things at first. He started CCing himself on vendor emails I hadn't included him on. He started showing up to client meetings I hadn't told him about, which meant someone at the shop was telling him my schedule. He started asking detailed questions about the ownership structure. What would happen to the business if I were incapacitated, whether I had a buy-sell agreement drafted. I thought he was being thorough. I thought he was thinking about the future. I was busy building furniture. The first time I actually felt something was wrong was about 8 months before the parking lot morning. We had a dispute with one of our lumber suppliers over a bad batch of material that warped in a hotel lobby installation. It was a significant problem. We had to redo 3 pieces, delay the install, and eat about $14,000 in labor and material. I handled the supplier call myself. I negotiated a partial credit. I thought the matter was closed. 2 weeks later, I found out Seth had contacted the supplier again after I had already resolved it and renegotiated the credit structure in a way that funneled the reimbursement into a separate vendor account I hadn't set up. When I asked him about it, he said he was just cleaning up the accounting. I pushed. He said the money would be reconciled at year-end. I let it go because we were in the middle of the hotel chain's biggest order of the year, and I genuinely did not have the bandwidth for a fight. That was my mistake. That was the mistake that almost cost me everything. About a month before the parking lot, I started noticing things in our project management system. Files accessed at strange hours. PDF exports of client contracts I hadn't requested. Our full vendor list downloaded twice in 1 week. I run a small business and I'm in the system constantly, so I notice things like that. But I didn't say anything yet. I just started paying attention. I also called my IT guy, a freelancer named Ben who'd set up our network a couple years back. I asked him to pull the access logs for our system for the past 6 months and send them to my personal email. Not the company email. My personal one. Ben sent me the logs on a Sunday afternoon. I spent 4 hours going through them. Seth had been exporting client data, financial records, and contract templates on a schedule, not randomly. Scheduled. Every other Friday going back almost 7 months. He'd also been accessing our QuickBooks file from his home network, which he was technically authorized to do, but the pattern of what he was looking at didn't match anything we had on the books. He was pulling profit and loss reports for individual projects, comparing them to labor costs, building some kind of picture I hadn't asked him to build. That's when I called my lawyer, a woman named Margaret who handled our standard business contracts. I laid it all out for her on a Monday morning. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Don't confront him yet, and start documenting everything." I did. I documented everything. That Thursday morning, the parking lot, I watched him from the window and I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not anger, not yet. More like the recognition of something you should have known earlier but didn't let yourself believe. I went back to my desk and I pulled up the access logs again. I looked at the last date he'd exported our full client list. It was 2 days before the parking lot morning. I still didn't say anything to him that day. He came in, said good morning, made coffee, asked me how the Henderson project was coming along. I said fine. He said great. We talked about a vendor invoice for 20 minutes like nothing in the world was wrong. 6 days later, Margaret called me. She told me she'd received a letter from an attorney named Clifford Walsh representing Seth. The letter alleged that I had been misrepresenting our revenue to Seth for the purpose of suppressing his equity value, that I had made major equipment purchases without his knowledge or consent, and that I had established vendor relationships that personally benefited me at the expense of the company. I read the letter twice. The equipment purchases he was referring to were a CNC router we'd bought 2 years ago that I'd discussed with him in writing before I signed the contract. The vendor relationships he mentioned were 2 suppliers I'd been using since before he joined the company. The revenue misrepresentation claim was so vague it almost felt like a placeholder, something thrown in to make the letter look substantial. But there was one thing in the letter that made me go very quiet. He had attached, as an exhibit, a printout of what appeared to be an email from me to our accountant saying that I was keeping 2 sets of numbers for the company. I had never written that email. Margaret called me the day after I read the letter. She said, "I want to ask you something directly." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "Is there any version of that email that's real?" I said, "No." She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Okay, then we need to figure out where it came from." The email had my name in the sender field, my company email address, the right signature block, even the right email thread format we used internally. But I had never written it and I had never sent it, which meant one of 2 things. Either it was fabricated entirely or someone had access to my email and sent it on my behalf. I gave Ben a second call. I told him what I was looking at. He went through my email server logs, not the email client, the actual server, and confirmed that no email matching that content or recipient had ever been sent from my account. Not deleted, not archived. It had never existed in the server record. Someone had created a document that looked like an email screenshot and printed it out. It was a forgery. That's when the cold thing in my chest turned into something else. I went home that night and I sat in my kitchen for a long time. I thought about 11 years. I thought about the couch and the cargo van and the gas station sandwiches. I thought about the hotel chain contract and the 18 employees who came in every morning and built things with their hands and expected a paycheck at the end of the week. I thought about what would happen to all of that if a judge looked at that forged email and believed it. Then I made a list of everything I had. I had Ben's server logs showing the email never existed. I had the access logs showing Seth's systematic data exports over 7 months. I had my original email thread with Seth where I'd notified him about the CNC purchase. I had every QuickBooks entry going back to when he joined. I had text messages between us discussing the vendor accounts he was now claiming I'd hidden from him. And then I remembered something I hadn't thought about in a year. When we'd moved into the current shop space about 3 years back, I'd had a security camera system installed. 12 cameras covering the production floor, the loading dock, the front office, and the parking lot. It was standard, insurance requirement. I'd set it up through a local security company and the footage backed up to a cloud account I owned personally. Seth knew the cameras existed. What Seth did not know, because I'd never mentioned it and it never came up, was that when we upgraded the system 8 months ago, the installer had added 2 cameras in the back office area, including one that covered the workstation where our shared company computer sat. I pulled up the cloud archive. I went back to the Friday 2 weeks before the letter arrived. One of the days the access logs showed a large file export. The timestamp matched. I watched Seth sit down at the shared workstation at 6:47 in the morning before anyone else arrived. He pulled up our QuickBooks. He spent 22 minutes going through it. Then he opened what looked like a document editing program, not our project management software, not email. He worked in it for about 11 minutes. He printed something. He folded the printout and put it in his jacket pocket. Then he deleted his browser history, stood up, and went to make coffee. I watched that clip 3 times. Then I called Margaret and I told her what I had. She was quiet for longer than usual. Then she said, "Send me everything tonight." The mediation was scheduled for 3 weeks out. Seth's attorney had pushed for it, which I now understood. He wanted the settlement before I had time to build a real case. He was expecting me to come in rattled, maybe with a lawyer trying to talk me into giving Seth a larger equity payout just to make the problem go away. Margaret and I spent those 3 weeks doing nothing but documentation. We had the server log certified by an independent forensic IT firm. We had the email forensics analyzed and documented in a formal report confirming the document was not generated from any email server and showed metadata inconsistencies with any legitimate email export. We organized the access log history into a timeline. We pulled the camera footage and had it time-stamped and certified. I also quietly had our accountant, a man named David who'd been doing our books since year 2, prepare an audit of every financial transaction Seth claimed I'd misrepresented. Every single one of Seth's allegations mapped directly to a transaction that had been properly documented, properly disclosed, and in most cases discussed with Seth in writing. I didn't sleep much those 3 weeks. I kept running through worst-case scenarios the way you do when something you care about is actually at risk. I'd lie awake thinking about what happens if the mediator looks at the forged email and decides it creates enough doubt. What happens if Seth's attorney is good enough to muddy the water? What happens if I lose not the case but the momentum? The employees who might hear rumors and start looking for other jobs, the hotel chain that might get nervous about a business dispute. I thought about the guy in the parking lot practicing being sad. The morning of the mediation, I drove to the office at 5:30. I walked through the shop. The equipment was all off, floor was swept, materials stacked the way my guys always left it at end of day. 12 years of accumulated knowledge and craft just sitting there in the quiet. I stood there for about 5 minutes. Then I went to meet my lawyer. Seth came in with Clifford Walsh and 2 binders, and what I can only describe as a careful expression, like someone who has prepared an emotion and is holding it in reserve. He nodded at me when he came in. I nodded back. The mediator, a retired judge named Harriet, who I will say was extremely sharp, started by asking both sides to lay out their core claims. Walsh went first. He was polished. He walked through Seth's allegations methodically. He presented the forged email as if it were routine documentary evidence. He talked about the equipment purchases, the vendor relationships, the equity valuation questions. He painted a picture of a business owner who had taken advantage of a good faith partner. He was good. I'll give him that. Then Margaret went. She started with the forensic IT report on the email. She explained in plain language what the metadata showed and what the server logs showed. She said the word fabricated twice in 2 sentences. Walsh objected to the characterization. Harriet raised her hand slightly and Walsh stopped talking. Margaret moved to the access log timeline, 7 months of systematic data exports on a biweekly schedule. She connected each export date to Seth's subsequent actions, vendor account inquiries, calls to her accountant asking questions he hadn't previously asked, the timing of his attorney engagement. Then she said she had video. She pulled up the clip on a laptop, the timestamp on the footage. Seth at the workstation at 6:47 in the morning. The document program, the printing, the jacket pocket, the browser history deletion. Clifford Walsh looked at Seth for a long moment. Seth's careful expression broke. Not dramatically. It wasn't like the movies. He didn't slam the table or storm out. He just went very still and his jaw tightened and he looked down at his hands. That was all. But it was enough. Harriet took a 15-minute recess. When we came back, Walsh asked to speak with his client privately for another 10 minutes. Harriet allowed it. Margaret and I sat in the hallway on plastic chairs and didn't talk much. She got coffee from the machine. I didn't want any. When they came back in, Walsh said his client wished to withdraw the claims. There was more to it after that. The formal unwinding of a business partnership is not a clean or simple thing. Seth's equity stake was bought out at a valuation based on the actual books, not the inflated number his filing had implied. He signed a non-solicitation agreement covering our clients and employees. Margaret made sure the forensic report and the footage were preserved in case anything ever resurfaced. Seth and I did not shake hands. He walked out without looking at me. Walsh said something brief and professional to Margaret on their way out. The door closed. I drove back to the shop. My floor manager, a guy named Russell who'd been with me for 6 years, was running a walnut panel set through the wide belt sander when I walked in. He looked up. I gave him a thumbs up. He nodded and went back to work. There are things I've thought about since that day that I probably should have thought about earlier. I trusted Seth with access he'd accumulated gradually, and I was too focused on the work to notice the access expanding past what made sense. I told myself the late-hour logins were dedication. I told myself the financial questions were due diligence. I told myself a lot of things because the alternative, that someone I brought into something I'd spent 11 years building was mapping the architecture of a takeover, was a thing I didn't want to sit with. But here's the thing nobody tells you about building something. The same focus that lets you get up at 4:30 and drive 40 minutes to a storage unit and eat a gas station sandwich for the 400th time also makes you bad at looking sideways. You get locked in on what's in front of you, and sometimes what's in front of you is exactly what someone is counting on. I haven't replaced Seth's role with another equity partner. Russell handles a lot of the operational coordination now, and I brought in a part-time operations consultant named Vera who works with us 10 hours a week and has no interest in ever being anyone's business partner. The hotel chain renewed their contract last fall. We hired 2 new guys in January. The camera system is still up, still backing up to my personal cloud account. I added 2 more cameras last spring. I've thought a lot about the moment Seth folded the printout into his jacket pocket and then went to make coffee like it was a normal morning. That image stays with me more than anything else from that whole period. Not the forged email. Not the mediation room. Just that, a man printing something he'd fabricated, pocketing it, and then asking me 20 minutes later how the Henderson project was coming along. What I kept coming back to, in the months after everything settled, was how long I had looked directly at what was happening and found other explanations for it. The late logins were dedication. The financial questions were thoroughness. The expanding access was efficiency. I wasn't naive. I'd been running a business for 11 years. I knew what people were capable of. But I had brought Seth in, and that meant some part of me needed him to be what I'd decided he was when I signed the paperwork. That's the thing about trust that nobody explains clearly enough. It isn't just a feeling. It's a decision you make, and like any decision, it has to be updated when the evidence changes. I kept updating my explanations instead of updating my decision. And that gap, between what I was seeing and what I was willing to conclude, is exactly the space Seth was working in. I don't think Seth was born a person who forged documents. I think he made a series of small choices, each one a little easier than the last because the previous one had gone unpunished. First, he restructured a vendor credit without telling me. Then, he started exporting data on a schedule. Then he built a strategy around information he'd gathered without my knowledge. Then he opened a document editor and created something that had never existed and printed it out and put it in his pocket. Each step probably felt like a logical extension of the last one. That's how it works. Not a single dramatic moment of deciding to become someone who does this, but a slow accumulation of smaller decisions that add up to the same place. What stopped it wasn't luck. It was preparation I'd done for completely unrelated reasons. An insurance requirement, a system upgrade, a freelancer I'd called because I noticed something small and decided to pay attention, None of those things were put in place to catch Seth specifically. They were just the habits of someone who'd built something real and understood that real things require maintenance and attention. The cameras were there because I cared about the shop. The access logs were there because Ben was thorough. The documentation was there because Margaret told me to start keeping it, and I listened. That's the part I want to be honest about. I didn't outmaneuver Seth because I'm smarter than him or because I saw through him earlier than I should have. I won because I had spent 11 years building systems that reflected how seriously I took what I'd built. The same discipline that got me up at 4:30 and kept me going through the lean years also meant I had a cloud archive, a careful IT guy, and a lawyer I trusted. Seth was counting on chaos. He found order instead. Russell is still with me. The hotel chain renewed. We hired 2 new guys in January. The shop runs quieter now, in a good way. I kept the cameras. Added 2 more.